A millionaire gave $250 to a beggar to buy food for her child. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his beloved, who died 23 years ago. Alexander Hayes sat at a table in one of London's most exclusive restaurants, but all the luxury around him meant nothing. Nothing could fill the emptiness inside him. He stared out the window, watching the rain pour down onto the streets, the droplets sliding down the glass like tears mirroring the weight in his heart. The world outside was gray and dreary, perfectly reflecting his mood. Always rainy, always dark, always lonely. It had been this way for over 2 decades, ever since his wife, Isabella, had died tragically. Alexander hadn't been able to move on. Her death had left a hole that no amount of money or success could fill. He had built a financial empire, yet his victories felt hollow. He went through the motions, attending business meetings and lavish dinners. But everything was just a distraction from the pain he carried with him every single day. Alexander absent-mindedly swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid spin in circles. Business deals, fancy dinners, luxurious events, it all tasted bland to him now. None of it mattered. He let out a sigh, the weight of the years pressing down on him. The truth was, despite all his success, Alexander was utterly alone. He had no children, at least none that he knew of. Isabella had never wanted to discuss the idea of kids before she passed, and Alexander hadn't pushed her on it. Now he regretted it deeply. What he wouldn't give to have a piece of her still alive, something of her to protect and love. Alexander paid the bill and stood up, slipping into his wool coat. The restaurant was buzzing with conversations and laughter, but to him, it was just noise, as distant as if it were happening in another world. He walked out onto the wet sidewalk, where the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. The city pulsed with life around him, but Alexander felt nothing but the chill of the rain and the weight of his own solitude. The walk home took him past places he and Isabella used to visit together. Every corner, every building seemed tied to a memory of a time when life had seemed so much simpler, so much happier. But now all that remained were ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Isabella's grave. Paris would have been the natural place for her to rest, but for reasons Alexander never fully understood, she had chosen London. Maybe it was because the city represented the new life they had started together, a life that had been cut short too soon. As he walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Under the awning of a shop, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight tugged at something deep within Alexander. He paused, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in situations like this. Over the years, he'd made countless donations to charities, but dealing with someone in need face-to-face wasn't something he was used to. Yet there was something about this young woman that made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held the baby so carefully, with a tenderness that reminded him of someone. Alexander approached slowly, the rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $250 in cash he had just withdrawn from an ATM. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a moment, Alexander felt something stir inside him, a connection to this stranger, as if their pain was somehow shared. He didn't say anything more, just nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. It was as if something had awakened inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. When he finally got home, Alexander was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of the rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the woman and her baby kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, like always, he would visit Isabella's grave. But little did he know that routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Alexander followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his typical tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Isabella's grave. The gray sky outside his window matched his mood perfectly, and the city was still wet from the rainstorm that had drenched it the night before. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the familiar heaviness settling into his chest as he prepared for yet another somber visit to the cemetery. As Alexander made his way to the cemetery, his mind wandered back to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why the image of them lingered in his thoughts. Over the years, he had seen countless people in need, but something about that encounter had stuck with him. There had been a look in the young woman's eyes, a mix of desperation and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. It unsettled him. Arriving at the cemetery, Alexander took the familiar path toward Isabella's grave. The place was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place well, too well. Each visit was the same. He would stand in front of her headstone, talk to her as if she were still there, then leave, feeling the same emptiness he had felt since the day she died. But today was different. As he approached the grave, Alexander noticed something unusual. There was someone there, someone kneeling in front of Isabella's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman from the night before, her baby cradled in her arms. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Alexander stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Isabella? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. He felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Alexander shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "You were there yesterday," he said slowly, outside the restaurant. "I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms as if the connection between them was enough of an explanation. But for Alexander, it wasn't. He needed to understand what was happening, why this woman, this stranger, was at his wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" Alexander asked, his voice firmer now. "How do you know Isabella?" For a moment, the woman hesitated, as if she were deciding whether or not to answer. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and resolve. "Isabella," she said softly, "was my mother." Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might have misheard her. He stared at the woman in disbelief, his mind struggling to catch up with what she had just said. "Your mother," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. Isabella, she never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Alexander felt like the world had come to a standstill. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words, but nothing added up. Isabella couldn't have had a child. She would have told him. She wouldn't have kept something like that from him. Or would she? He took a step back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said, her voice soft but steady. "But it's the truth. My name is Sophie, and Isabella was my mother." Alexander's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at the woman, Sophie, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind raced with questions, but he didn't know where to begin. How had this happened? How could he not have known? "Why?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sophie looked down at the ground, her expression filled with sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never knew her. She died before I could meet her. I was raised by another family." Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent more than 2 decades mourning the loss of his wife, believing he had known everything about her. And now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything, a secret that had been buried with her for all these years. He took a deep breath, his mind reeling. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, Alexander saw something familiar in them, a glimmer of Isabella. I found out about her a few months ago, she explained. I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. And when I found out where she was buried, I had to come. Alexander stared at her, still struggling to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and anger. But underneath it all, there was something else, a spark of hope. Hope that somehow, this connection to Isabella hadn't been lost after all. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Isabella really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild, a part of Isabella that still existed in the world. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something other than grief. He didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing. His life had just changed in ways he never could have imagined. Alexander stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind still struggling to grasp what she had just revealed. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears. The baby in Sophie's arms shifted, letting out a soft whimper, and that small sound seemed to snap him out of his daze. How is this possible? Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with questions. He felt betrayed by the very memory of Isabella, as if the woman he had spent over 2 decades mourning had been someone entirely different. But even in the fog of his confusion, he knew one thing. Sophie believed what she was saying. I know it's a lot to take in, Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. I've spent my whole life trying to understand too, but I'm telling you the truth. Isabella was my mother. Alexander's chest tightened. Why didn't she tell me? He muttered, almost to himself. The thought that Isabella had kept something so monumental from him was unbearable. He had spent so many nights lying awake, thinking about what they could have had together if only things had gone differently. Now, it seemed like those what-ifs had taken on a whole new, painful meaning. Sophie shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with empathy. I don't know why she kept it from you, she said. I never had the chance to ask her. She passed away when I was still a baby. Alexander's thoughts swirled, and he tried to focus. There had to be more to the story. Who raised you then? He asked. If Isabella was your mother, why didn't I know about you? Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the ground as if the weight of the explanation was too much to carry. After she died, I was put into the care of another family, she said. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently. All I had was a name and bits of information I could piece together. I didn't even know where to start looking for you until a few months ago. Alexander's heart ached. He had lived his life believing he knew everything there was to know about Isabella, only to discover that there were chapters of her life he hadn't even read. So you came here looking for answers? Sophie nodded. Yes, I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come. Alexander's gaze fell to the headstone, Isabella's name etched in cold, unforgiving stone. It had been his ritual for so long, visiting this grave, talking to Isabella, trying to make peace with her absence. But now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything felt different. His memories, his grief, his understanding of who Isabella had been. He took a deep breath, his mind desperately searching for something solid to cling to in this storm of emotion. "And this baby," Alexander said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child in Sophie's arms. "Is this my grandchild?" Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through her tension. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is Daniel." Alexander stared at the baby, who looked so small, so fragile. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Daniel was a connection to Isabella, to the life they could have had, a life that had been hidden from him, but that he now had a chance to embrace. As Alexander processed this, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. For years, he had been stuck in the past, mourning Isabella and the life they'd lost. Now, standing here, he realized that life hadn't disappeared completely. It had continued silently, without him, and now he was being given a chance to reclaim a piece of it. But the betrayal still lingered. How could Isabella have kept this from him? How could she have made such a monumental decision without even telling him she was pregnant? I don't understand, Alexander said finally, his voice hoarse. Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone? Sophie's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. I don't know the details, she admitted, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child. Or maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to be a father. I don't know, Alexander. I wish I did. Alexander shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But she should have given me a choice, he said. She should have let me decide. Sophie nodded. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you. The idea that Isabella had kept Sophie a secret out of some misguided sense of protection left Alexander feeling conflicted. He had always believed that Isabella trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now he was beginning to see that there were parts of her he had never really known. Alexander's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to Sophie, but to the life he never knew existed, to the possibilities that had been lost but could now be reclaimed. What do you want from me? Alexander asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. I don't want anything from you, she said. I just want to know where I came from, and I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife. Alexander nodded, the weight of her words settling in. The truth about Isabella, the truth he had spent so many years without. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing. His life had just been irrevocably changed. There was no going back to the way things had been, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. Alexander stood in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what Sophie had just told him. Isabella had a daughter. His daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung, but it was layered with confusion, regret, and something else he hadn't expected, responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be part of, but they were here now, standing right in front of him. I still don't understand, Alexander finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger fading into something softer. Isabella never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me? Sophie's eyes flickered with empathy. I don't know what her reasons were, Alexander, she said. I've asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, whatever her reasons, and it's affected both of us. Alexander took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Isabella had always been so private, even with him. They'd had their share of arguments about how much she kept to herself. But this was a secret on a level he couldn't have imagined. Do you know anything about her? Alexander asked, his voice tentative, almost as if he was afraid of the answer. About why she did it? Sophie sighed and looked down at the baby in her arms. I wish I knew more, she said. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece together what happened, and the truth is, there are a lot of gaps. But I know one thing for sure. She loved you. Alexander's eyes widened at that. She told you that? He asked, his voice cracking. Sophie shook her head softly. No, she said, but I've seen it in everything I've found about her. The way she talked about you to people, the way she lived her life. It was always clear that you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things. Alexander clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had spent years trying to make sense of Isabella's death, trying to come to terms with the fact that they would never have the future they had dreamed of. But this revelation had reopened old wounds he thought had healed. Now he wasn't just mourning the loss of his wife. He was mourning the life he had never known about, the daughter he had never been given the chance to raise. And you? Alexander asked, his voice strained. Why now? Why did you decide to find me? Sophie met his gaze with a steady calmness that surprised him. I didn't find out about Isabella being my mother until a few months ago, she explained. Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about how I was adopted. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here to find out more about who I am and where I came from. And to be honest, I wasn't sure what I would find. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He could see the weight Sophie carried in her eyes, the burden of a past she hadn't been able to access, a burden that had now become his to bear as well. He glanced at the baby in Sophie's arms, who was now fast asleep. The small rise and fall of the child's chest seemed almost surreal to Alexander. This was his grandson, his blood, a continuation of the life he had shared with Isabella, even if it had been hidden from him for all these years. Daniel, Sophie said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. His name is Daniel. Alexander's eyes softened as he looked at the baby. Daniel, he repeated quietly. The name felt strange on his tongue, but it was also grounding in a way that Alexander hadn't expected. For so long, he had felt adrift, moving through life without any real purpose. But now, as he stood there with Sophie and Daniel, something was shifting inside him. I didn't come here to ask for anything, Sophie continued, breaking Alexander from his thoughts. I'm not expecting you to play a role in my life or in Daniel's life. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from. And now I do. Alexander stared at her, feeling a tug of emotion in his chest. He wasn't sure what Sophie expected from him, but he knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't walk away from her. You're my daughter, Alexander said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. He had never imagined himself saying those words, certainly not like this in a cemetery, standing in front of his wife's grave. And that makes Daniel my grandson. Sophie looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was going with this. I've spent my whole life building something, Alexander continued, his voice soft but resolute. But none of it ever mattered. Not really. After Isabella died, I didn't have anything left. But now I'm realizing that maybe I still have a chance to fix that. Maybe I still have a chance to be something more than just a businessman. Sophie blinked, her face a mixture of surprise and skepticism. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying that if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life, Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly. I've missed so much already, but I don't want to miss any more. Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, Alexander could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known. But there was also a flicker of hope there, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. I don't know if it'll be easy, Sophie said finally, her voice soft. There's a lot we don't know about each other. Alexander nodded. I know, but I'm willing to try if you are. Sophie looked down at Daniel, then back at Alexander. Okay, she said quietly. We can try. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope that maybe, despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Alexander walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind was a swirling storm of emotions. The revelation that Isabella had kept a secret this monumental from him gnawed at him, and the thought of Sophie and Daniel lingered in his mind. His life, once so controlled and predictable, felt as if it had been flipped upside down in the span of a few hours. The city around him bustled with its usual energy, but Alexander moved through it as though he were on autopilot. The encounter with Sophie had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed by Isabella, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility he now felt. Sophie was his daughter, and Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows as Alexander stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city. His thoughts returned to Isabella, her laugh, the way she used to look at him, the dreams they had shared before everything came crashing down. He had spent years trying to preserve her memory, to keep her alive in some small way through his grief. But now, with Sophie's revelation, Alexander was starting to wonder if he had ever really known Isabella at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What had she been thinking during those final months of her life? The questions buzzed in his mind, relentless, demanding answers he wasn't sure he could ever find. Alexander moved to his desk, where he kept a small collection of keepsakes from his time with Isabella. Old photos, letters, little trinkets that once meant something to them both. He picked up a photo of the two of them from their early days together, back when everything had seemed so full of promise. They looked so happy, so in love. He couldn't reconcile that version of Isabella with the woman who had kept something so life-changing from him. Sitting down, Alexander pulled out a worn notebook from the desk drawer. He hadn't touched it in years. It was Isabella's journal, something she had kept on and off throughout their marriage. He had found it after she died, but had never had the heart to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. Now, though, it felt like his only hope of understanding what had happened. With a deep breath, Alexander opened the journal. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant script he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He flipped through the pages, reading her thoughts on mundane things, dinners they had shared, vacations they had taken. But nothing stood out. He was searching for something, anything that might explain why she had hidden Sophie from him. And then, buried toward the back of the journal, he found it. The entry was dated just a few months before Isabella's death, and as Alexander's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. How could I let this happen now? After all these years, Alexander would never understand. He's so focused on the business, on our future, and I can't be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give him. I just wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I can't let him see me like this. I can't let him know. Alexander's chest tightened as he read the words. She had been scared of how he would react, scared of how her pregnancy would affect their lives. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why had she thought he wouldn't want to be part of it? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Isabella hadn't kept Sophie a secret because she didn't want him to know. She had done it because she thought it was for his own good. She had been trying to protect him, in her own way, from the burden of raising a child at a time when their lives were already complicated. Alexander slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It wasn't betrayal that Isabella had kept Sophie from him. It was fear. Fear of how he would react, fear of how it would change their lives. And maybe, in some small way, she had been trying to shield him from the pain she was feeling herself. But now, that decision had consequences. Sophie had grown up without knowing her father, and Alexander had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life, and Daniel's. There was no way to change what had happened, no way to go back and fix the choices Isabella had made. But there was still a path forward. Sophie had come to him seeking answers, and now more than ever, Alexander knew he couldn't turn his back on her. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If there was one thing he could still do, it was be there for Sophie and Daniel. He had already lost too much time, and he wasn't about to lose any more. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sophie. He had promised her he would try, and now more than ever, he wanted to keep that promise. He wasn't sure how it would work or how they would navigate the complicated mess of emotions between them, but he was willing to figure it out. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Sophie had given him. His heart raced as he waited for her to answer, unsure of what he would say when she did. After a few rings, Sophie's voice came through the line, soft but steady. "Hello, Sophie," Alexander began, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt. "It's me, Alexander. I've been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and Alexander held his breath, unsure of how she would respond. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Yeah," she said. "I think we do." Alexander exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and right now, that was enough. The next time Alexander saw Sophie, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, far from the bustling streets of the city. He had chosen the spot deliberately, intimate but neutral, somewhere they could talk without the weight of the past hanging too heavily over them. He arrived early, nervously adjusting his shirt collar as he sat down at the table, waiting for her. His mind was still spinning with everything he had read in Isabella's journal. It had brought him closer to understanding her, but it had also deepened the ache of not being able to ask her directly why she had made the choices she did. Alexander looked up as Sophie entered the cafe, Daniel in her arms. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her face calm but cautious. There was a tension in her movements, like she wasn't sure how this was going to go. "Hi," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted Daniel in her arms, trying to make him comfortable before looking at Alexander again. "Thanks for meeting me." Alexander nodded, his throat tightening with nerves. "Of course," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He glanced down at Daniel, who was looking up at him with wide eyes, curious but quiet. "How is he?" Sophie smiled faintly, brushing a hand over the baby's head. "He's doing good, growing fast." There was a brief silence between them, neither quite sure how to start the conversation that was looming over them. Alexander cleared his throat, deciding it was best to just dive in. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," Alexander began, his voice low. "And I found something that explains a little bit of why Isabella didn't tell me about you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but guarded. "What did you find?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out Isabella's journal. He slid it across the table towards Sophie. "I found this. It's her journal from the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, why she kept you a secret." Sophie stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover, but not opening it. "She wrote about me?" Alexander nodded. "She didn't name you directly, but it's clear that she was scared. Scared of how I would react, scared of how having a child would affect our lives. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it from me." Sophie's expression softened, her hand resting on the journal for a moment before she pulled it back. "I've spent my whole life wondering why she didn't want me," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that Alexander hadn't seen before. "It's hard to hear that it wasn't just about me, that she was trying to protect you too." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't that she didn't want you, Sophie. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost." Sophie let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I guess I always imagined that if I found out why she gave me up, it would give me some kind of closure. But now it just feels complicated." Alexander nodded. "I know it's not easy, but the one thing I've learned is that you can't change the past. You can only decide what to do with the present." There was a pause, and Alexander could see the emotions flickering across Sophie's face. Sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief. It was as if hearing those words about her mother had lifted some of the weight she had been carrying for so long. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time feeling angry at her, at you, and now I don't know what to feel." Alexander's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but he knew there were no simple answers. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to make sense of the mess that had been left behind. "I get it," Alexander said softly. "I've been angry too, but maybe we can try to figure this out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance. "You really want to be a part of my life? After everything?" "I do," Alexander said without hesitation. "I've already lost so much time, Sophie. I don't want to lose any more. If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try, but I need time, Alexander." "This is a lot to take in." Alexander reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, but not quite touching it. "I understand. We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush." Sophie glanced at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, and then back at Alexander. "He doesn't have a grandfather, you know," she said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. Alexander's heart swelled. "I'd like to change that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she wiped it away quickly. "I think Daniel would like that too." For the first time, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years believing that his life had ended when Isabella died, that there was no way forward. But now, sitting here with Sophie and Daniel, he realized that there was still something left to fight for. The days that followed their meeting at the cafe were filled with cautious optimism. Alexander and Sophie began to see more of each other, though always with a certain hesitance in the air, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that would break the fragile bond they were starting to form. Alexander, for his part, was determined to show Sophie that he was serious about being part of her life. But he also understood her need for space. It wasn't easy. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how much he had missed, how much time had slipped through his fingers. And as much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts often returned to Isabella and the choices she had made. He had spent so many years idealizing her, putting her on a pedestal, that it was difficult to reconcile the image of the woman he had loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. But as Alexander spent more time with Sophie and Daniel, he realized that the past, no matter how painful, didn't have to define the future. They were slowly building something new together, something fragile but real. One afternoon, Sophie invited Alexander to her apartment for the first time. It was a modest place, small but cozy, and as Alexander stepped inside, he could see the care Sophie had put into making it a home for her and Daniel. Toys were scattered on the living room floor, and a soft blanket was draped over the couch. The apartment smelled faintly of baby lotion and freshly brewed coffee. "Make yourself comfortable," Sophie said, motioning toward the couch as she took Daniel out of his stroller. "I'll get us some coffee." Alexander nodded, sitting down and looking around the room. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride in seeing the life Sophie had built for herself, but also a deep sense of regret that he hadn't been there to witness any of it. He had missed so much, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, that sense of loss would always linger. As Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Alexander's gaze drifted to a small photo frame on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Sophie holding Daniel, both of them smiling at the camera, their eyes bright with joy. It was a simple image, but it hit Alexander hard. He realized that he was looking at the family he never knew he had, a family he was only now beginning to understand. Sophie returned a few moments later, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed one to Alexander and sat down across from him, adjusting Daniel on her lap. The baby cooed softly, his chubby hands reaching for his mother's hair. "So," Sophie said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything. About us, about Mom, and there's something else I think you should know." Alexander looked up from his coffee, his heart rate picking up slightly. He had grown used to the idea that there would always be new revelations when it came to Isabella and Sophie's past, but that didn't make them any easier to hear. "What is it?" he asked carefully. Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with Daniel's tiny hand. "After we talked about Mom and why she kept me a secret from you, I started digging a little deeper. I wanted to understand more about her life, about why she made the choices she did. And I found something that, while it changes things..." Alexander frowned, setting his mug down on the coffee table. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a small box that Alexander hadn't noticed before, bringing it back to the couch and setting it between them. "This," Sophie said quietly, opening the box, "was in Mom's things. It's a letter, but it's not from her. It's from someone else, someone I think you knew." Alexander's stomach tightened as Sophie handed him the letter. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Isabella, but the signature at the bottom made Alexander's heart stop. It was from someone named James. Not just any James, but James Porter, an old friend of Alexander's from his younger days. The two had lost touch over the years, but they had been close once, long before Alexander had met Isabella. As he read the letter, Alexander's blood ran cold. "Isabella, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to put it down on paper, even if only for my own peace of mind. I know we've kept this secret for so long, but it's weighing on me now more than ever. Alexander has no idea about what happened between us, and I can't bear to keep pretending. I'm not asking you to tell him. I know how complicated things are, but I need you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you, about what we had. If things were different, I would have fought harder for you, but I know you made your choice. I just hope you're happy, even if it's not with me. With love, James." Alexander's hands trembled as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind reeling. James and Isabella, had they been together? Had there been something between them that he had never known about? Sophie watched him carefully, her expression full of empathy. "I didn't want to tell you right away," she said softly. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, but I thought you deserved to know. Alexander couldn't find the words. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had known James for years, trusted him, considered him a friend. But this letter suggested something entirely different, something that Alexander hadn't even considered. "Are you saying," Alexander began, his voice shaking, "are you saying that James and Isabella?" Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't know all the details. I don't know when it happened or how long it lasted. But yeah, it seems like they were involved at some point." Alexander felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He stood up, pacing the small living room as his mind raced. He had always believed that he and Isabella had shared something special, something unbreakable. But now, this letter, it called everything into question. Had Isabella loved James? Had she kept this secret, too, out of fear of losing Alexander? Or had there been something more, something that Alexander had been blind to all along? "I can't believe this," Alexander muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to think." Sophie stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I know this is hard, Alexander. Believe me, I've been struggling with it too. But I don't think Mom ever wanted to hurt you. I think she was just scared like she was with everything else." Alexander swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness boiling inside him. He had spent years mourning Isabella, grieving for the life they had lost. And now it seemed like that life had been built on lies, on secrets he had never known. "What do we do with this?" Alexander asked, his voice breaking. "How do we move forward from here?" Sophie sighed, her eyes filled with the same uncertainty Alexander felt. "I don't know," she said. "I wish I had the answers. But I think it's just going to take time. Time to process everything. Time to figure out what it all means." Alexander nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He didn't know how to move forward, how to reconcile the love he had for Isabella with the truth of her relationship with James. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to lose Sophie. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I don't want to lose you," Alexander said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Whatever happens, whatever we find out, I don't want this to come between us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're not going to lose me, Alexander. We're in this together." Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the answer he had been hoping for, but it was enough for now. It was enough. The revelation about James Porter consumed Alexander over the next few days. He tried to make sense of it, but no matter how much he thought about it, the answers remained elusive. His mind replayed old memories, moments from his past with both Isabella and James, searching for clues that might have hinted at this secret. But there was nothing, no moment that stood out, no suspicion that had ever crossed his mind. How could he have missed it? Alexander found himself pacing his apartment late into the night, unable to sleep. The letter Sophie had found was always on his mind. It raised so many questions. Had Isabella loved James? Had it been a brief affair or something more serious? And why had James never told him the truth? More than anything, Alexander felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted both of them, Isabella as his wife and James as one of his closest friends. But now, that trust felt shattered, replaced by a gnawing doubt that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. He needed answers. He couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. After some searching, he found James's contact information. They hadn't spoken in years, not since they had drifted apart after Isabella's death. But this wasn't something Alexander could let go of. He had to confront him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Alexander dialed the number. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello." James's voice was older, more tired than Alexander remembered, but it was unmistakable. "James," Alexander said, his voice tight. "It's Alexander Hayes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Alexander could hear the hesitation in James's voice when he finally responded. "Alexander, it's been a long time." "It has," Alexander agreed, keeping his tone calm, even though the tension was building inside him. "I need to talk to you. About Isabella." Another pause. "Isabella," James's voice was cautious, almost as if he knew what was coming. "What about her?" "I found a letter," Alexander said, his words sharp now. "A letter you wrote to her about something that happened between the two of you. I think you know what I'm talking about. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Alexander could feel the weight of it, the unspoken truth hanging between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. I didn't think you'd ever find out. Alexander clenched his jaw, the confirmation hitting him hard. So it's true then? You and Isabella. What was it, James? An affair? A one-time thing? James let out a heavy sigh. It wasn't like that, Alexander. It wasn't an affair. It was complicated. Alexander's anger flared. Complicated? That's all you have to say? I trusted you, James. You were my friend. I know, James replied, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt you, Alexander. And I don't think Isabella did, either. What happened between us, it was a mistake. But it wasn't what you think. Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. Then tell me what it was, because from where I'm standing, it looks like both of you kept a pretty big secret from me. James hesitated again, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. It was a long time ago, before you and Isabella were even serious. We had a brief thing, but it ended. Isabella chose you, Alexander. She loved you. Whatever happened between us, it was over long before you two got married. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. It was over, he repeated, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. Why didn't either of you tell me? I don't know, James admitted. At first, it didn't seem like it mattered. It was in the past, and we both moved on. But as time went on, I guess we were both afraid of what it would do to you, to your marriage. And then, after Isabella died, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I didn't want to add to your pain. Alexander shook his head, his anger simmering just below the surface. You think keeping it from me was better? You think I wouldn't have wanted to know the truth? James's voice was filled with regret. I don't know, Alexander. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. But looking back, maybe I should have told you. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He wanted to yell, to unleash the anger and frustration that had been building inside him since he'd read the letter. But at the same time, he felt exhausted. The weight of all these secrets, all these lies, was overwhelming. I don't know what to say to you, James, Alexander said finally, his voice strained. I don't even know how to process this. I understand, James replied quietly. I'm sorry, Alexander. I truly am. If I could go back and change things, I would. But all I can do now is apologize and hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me. Forgiveness. Alexander wasn't sure if he was capable of that right now. The betrayal felt too fresh, too raw. But part of him knew that holding on to the anger wouldn't bring him peace, either. I don't know if I can forgive you, James, Alexander said honestly. But I appreciate you telling me the truth. There was a long pause before James spoke again. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have. Alexander wasn't sure if he wanted to hear more. He wasn't sure if he wanted to dig any deeper into a past that had already caused him so much pain. But he knew one thing. He needed time. Time to process, time to heal. I need some time, Alexander said finally. I don't know what comes next, but I need to figure that out. Take all the time you need, James replied softly. I'm sorry, Alexander. Truly. The call ended, and Alexander stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had the truth now, or at least part of it, but it didn't bring the closure he had hoped for. If anything, it only made him feel more lost. Later that evening, Alexander sat down with Sophie to tell her about the conversation with James. She listened quietly, her face unreadable, but he could see the same conflicted emotions playing out behind her eyes. I'm not sure what to think anymore, Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I thought finding out the truth would help, but now I just feel lost. Sophie nodded, her hand resting gently on Daniel's back as he dozed in her arms. I get it, she said softly. I've been struggling with the same thing. But maybe the truth isn't always about closure. Maybe it's just about understanding the past so we can figure out how to move forward. Alexander looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude for her presence in his life. Despite everything, they were still here, together, facing the uncertainty of the future. And maybe that was enough for now. I think you're right, Alexander said quietly. I don't know what comes next, but I want to figure it out with you." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. "We'll figure it out one step at a time." As Alexander sat there with his daughter and grandson, he realized that despite the pain and confusion of the past, there was still something worth fighting for. The truth had been messy, complicated, and heartbreaking, but it had also brought him closer to Sophie and Daniel. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The weeks that followed Alexander's conversation with James were filled with quiet introspection. The truth about Isabella and James had forced Alexander to confront a part of his past that he had never anticipated. He found himself oscillating between anger and sorrow, but slowly, as the days passed, something else began to take root: a sense of acceptance. It wasn't an easy process. Alexander still woke up some mornings feeling the weight of the betrayal, the gnawing ache of not having known everything about Isabella. But he had also started to see that the past, as painful as it was, couldn't be changed. What mattered now was how he chose to live with it and what he did with the time he had left. Sophie had been a constant presence through it all. Their relationship, though still fragile, was growing stronger with each passing day. She had allowed him into her life, into Daniel's life, and in doing so, she had given Alexander a reason to keep moving forward. One afternoon, Alexander found himself at the park with Sophie and Daniel. It was a warm day, the sun casting a golden hue over the grass as they strolled along the path. Daniel was in his stroller, babbling happily as Sophie pushed him along. Alexander walked beside them, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for so long. They reached a bench near the lake, and Sophie gestured for Alexander to sit. She unbuckled Daniel from the stroller and set him on her lap, smiling as he squirmed excitedly at the sight of the ducks swimming by. "Hard to believe how much he's grown already," Alexander said, watching Daniel with a smile. "Yeah," Sophie replied, her voice soft with affection. "It feels like just yesterday he was a tiny baby." She glanced at Alexander, her expression thoughtful. "I'm really glad you're here, Alexander. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm glad we're figuring this out together." Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, for some kind of acknowledgement that they were moving in the right direction. "I'm glad too," he said quietly. "I know I've made mistakes, and there's a lot I wish I could go back and change. But I'm grateful for this. For you and Daniel." Sophie nodded, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that hadn't been there when they first met. "I know it's been hard for both of us, but we're here now, and I think that's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the water. Alexander's mind wandered back to everything that had led him to this moment. The grief, the secrets, the painful revelations. But for the first time, he wasn't weighed down by it. Instead, he felt a sense of clarity. "I've been thinking a lot," Alexander said after a while, breaking the silence. "About the past, about everything that happened. And I realized that holding on to the anger and the hurt, it's not helping anyone. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why Isabella made the choices she did, but I think I'm ready to let go of the need for answers." Sophie looked at him, her expression soft but serious. "That's a big step, Alexander. I know how hard it's been for you." Alexander nodded. "It has, but I don't want the past to define what happens next. I want to focus on what we have now, on being there for you and Daniel." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "That means a lot to me, Alexander. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think you're right. We can't change the past, but we can move forward." Alexander felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. He knew it would always be there, lingering beneath the surface. But it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't carry. He had found something else, something stronger, a purpose. As they continued to sit by the lake, Sophie shifted in her seat, her voice hesitant but filled with hope. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking too. About Daniel. He's going to need a lot of people in his life who care about him, who love him. And I think you could be a big part of that if you want to be." Alexander's heart swelled at her words. "I want that more than anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be part of his life. Part of your life." Sophie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm really glad to hear that, because I think he could use a grandfather." The word hit Alexander with an unexpected force, but in the best possible way. Grandfather. It was a role he had never imagined for himself, especially after all the years of solitude and grief. But now it felt like the most important role he could ever have. "I'd be honored," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how good I'll be at it, but I'm willing to try." Sophie laughed softly, her hand resting on Daniel's tiny foot. "That's all we can do, right? Just try." They sat together, watching Daniel as he giggled at the ducks. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the next few months, Alexander's life continued to shift in ways he never thought possible. He and Sophie grew closer, navigating their complicated relationship with honesty and patience. There were still moments of tension, still questions that lingered between them, but they were learning to face those challenges together. Alexander also became more involved in Daniel's life. He found himself looking forward to the time he spent with his grandson, whether it was taking him to the park, reading him stories, or simply watching him explore the world with wide-eyed wonder. It was a new kind of joy, one that Alexander hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. And through it all, Alexander learned to let go of the anger and the bitterness that had once consumed him. He made peace with the fact that he would never have all the answers about Isabella, and that some things were better left in the past. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sophie and Daniel, the family he was rediscovering. One evening, as Alexander sat in his apartment, looking out over the city skyline, he realized how much had changed. The loneliness that had once defined him was no longer there. In its place was a sense of connection, of belonging, that he hadn't felt in years. He still visited Isabella's grave from time to time, but the visits were different now. They were less about mourning and more about reflecting. He had loved her deeply, and that love would always be a part of him. But he also knew that he had to let her go to make room for the life he had found with Sophie and Daniel. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Alexander felt a quiet contentment settle over him. It wasn't the life he had imagined all those years ago, but it was a life he had come to cherish. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, could be filled with hope. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and share your thoughts on the twists and turns life can bring. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that make us reflect on the value of family and forgiveness. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Remember, sometimes what seemed lost can be the beginning of something new and beautiful.